Hello and welcome to this special lecture on the topic of Hamas. Typically on this channel, I refrain from discussing either local or international politics and attempt to focus on things having to do with the martial arts and in particular the traditional martial arts. However, regrettably, my nation is under attack, and in this time of war, I found it necessary to reveal to the nations outside of the land of Israel certain truths that are unbeknownst to the majority of you. I'd like to tell you a little bit about this organization, Hamas, the nature of it, and its strong connotations to biblical themes, which I think is a topic which would be of great interest to a lot of listeners. So let us begin. Hamas is a terrorist organization, a terrorist group, which has governed Gaza roughly since around 2007. Now, Hamas has been around longer than that. It was founded in 1987. Now, let's do a timeline here. If you go back to the history books and you try to look up when was it that Palestinian people were first mentioned, actually, this is around 1968. So surprisingly, for many of you, the Palestinians weren't a recognized people or a nation prior to 1968. And where does the name Palestinians come from? This would all lead us back to Hamas in a moment. So back in biblical times, there was the land of Israel, which of course is the name given to it by the Israelites. Other peoples have called it by other names, but all of these peoples, whether they happen to have been the ancient Egyptians, the Phoenicians, the ancient Greeks, the ancient Romans, and the Philistines, which are central to this topic, we'll get to that in a moment, the Aramaics, all of these peoples are gone. The only surviving people from that region, from that era, are the Jewish people, formerly known as the Israelites. And today we have the Israeli Jews, of course. I am one among them. So back in those times, there were a group of people, not quite national grouping, but rather a grouping of tribes from roughly the same region, the coastal region of southern Israel, and they were called the Philistines. Now, based on the most recent studies and evidence of the past 20-30 years, it is nowadays agreed upon that the Philistines came by sea and raided the coastal regions of the land of Israel, and that they came from potentially the area of Crete, the ancient Greek island of Crete, and generally from the general area of Greece. A lot of them were red-headed. There are genetic studies on these peoples. So they were not originally from the Middle East, but they settled in the Middle East and have lived in the southern shores of the land of Israel for several centuries until they basically faded into the pages of history. Many of them were killed. Others migrated away. Others still simply intermarried and interbred with other peoples in the region. And they lost their cultural identity, which was fragile to begin with because they're Gentiles that came from afar. And they were no longer Philistines by the time, say, the Romans were in the region. Philistines weren't around. But then the Romans had their quarrels with us Jews. And, you know, there are periods when the Romans were on good relations with the Jews, other periods there were wars between the Romans and the Jews. That is for another lecture and another time, and I wouldn't be getting into that. But my point was that the Romans wanted to annoy the Jews and basically to spit in their face, culturally speaking. And therefore, when the Romans conquered the land of Israel, the name they gave to it was Palestina. Palestina after the Philistines, after the Plishtim. The Philistines were called the Plishtim by the Israelites, and something like the Palestinians by the Romans in their Latin language, hence the name Palestina. They named the land they conquered after the former mortal enemies of the Israelites, which later became the Jewish people, because they wanted to annoy the Israelites. And so, over the years, once Islam rose and the Arabs came and conquered the region, for them it was also the land of Israel. But once the British came along, that is after the First World War, they renamed the place back to the name Palestine. Palestine after Palestina, and Palestina after the Philistines. So we have the name Palestine, completely made up by the British. Okay, it's the English pronunciation of Palestina, and Palestina is the Latin pronunciation of land of Philistines, which Philistines is the name given to the Plishtim, the mortal enemies of the Israelites. And then later on, in the late 1960s, when the Palestinian people in the land of Israel were seeking to form a national identity, they adopted the name Palestinians, in Arabic Palestini, in Hebrew Palestinaim, okay? And they used the name Palestinians based on the English word Palestine, which was borrowed from the Latin word Palestina, which was from the Philistines, the Plishtim. So you get how convoluted that is. Very convoluted. And of course, how could those people calling themselves Palestinians be in any way, shape, or form related to these conquerors that came into the land of Israel in biblical times from the area of Greece, many of whom were red-headed? We're talking about tan-skinned, like many Jews and Israelis, by the way, tan-skinned, brown-eyed, curly-haired, or straight-haired, Arab-looking people who immigrated from Arab countries. And indeed, they have Arab names. They go by surnames such as Al-Lubnani, from the guy from Lebanon, that's a surname. Al-Misri, some say that as many as half of the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip, for example, descend from the Al-Misri tribe, which is Al-Misri is from the country of Misr. Do you know which country Misr is? That's Egypt. Okay, Al-Misri from Egypt. Okay, and you have Al-Baghdadi. Al-Baghdadi is from Baghdad, which is a city in Iraq. So why do these people have those surnames that actually relate to places that are far away from the land of Israel? Because these people came from far away as work immigrants over the past 150 years. Now, that does not mean that they're not human or they don't have rights. It just means that they are work immigrants that came here over the past 150 years, whilst the Jewish people have been living here pretty consistently in large or small numbers for probably, it seems, based on evidence, over 3,000 years. Let me remind you that Islam also comes down to us from the 7th century after the death of Jesus Christ, whilst, the Jews are a few thousand years before that. All right, so how does that all bring us to Hamas? So the Palestinians established a national identity in the late 60s because the Palestinians are made up of many, we're talking about hundreds of different large families and tribes that were scattered all over Israel. We have Palestinians who've been living in the Gaza Strip, which is on the news nowadays. We have Palestinians living in Judea and Samaria, which has been given the wrong and deceitful name the West Bank, referring to the West Bank of Jordan. We should actually call it by its true name, Yehuda Veshomron, Yehuda Veshomron in Hebrew, Judea and Samaria. That's the historical, biblical Jewish name. In the Galilee, of course, in the Golan Heights, and all sorts of places like these, they all have different Palestinian groups, families, tribes that speak different dialects of Arabic, that have different customs and different traditions and different histories, because they came from many different Arab countries. Some of them are Muslim, the majority, and a minority are actually Christians. And nearly all of them are Sunni Muslims, which would be important later on in the lecture. So the Sunni Muslims make for the majority of Muslims in the Arab world, and the Shiite Muslims are a minority. I'll get to that later. Okay, so in the late 1960s, these people first begin to manifest a national identity. Now you might ask, why late 1960s? Why haven't they said anything earlier? Well, to come to grips with this, we have to understand the historical context. What happens in the 1960s, and specifically in the late 1960s? Well, in 1967, we have the Six-Day War. The Arab armies of several nations were intent on attacking and annihilating the state of Israel. Now, when I say annihilating, you have to realize these people were desiring to kill off, exterminate, and literally, let me quote them, to throw into the ocean every single Jew in the land of Israel. Women, children, the elderly, the crippled, everybody. Once they have assembled their armies on our borders, the Israeli military was smart and quick enough to attack them hours before they did so themselves. And by surprising them in this manner, we were able to defeat those armies in mere 6 days. Following this terrible defeat from the Arab perspective, they've come to realize that it is not a feasible plan. They couldn't create a feasible plan to defeat the state of Israel with just typical standard armies. They had to also, in tandem, attempt to destabilize Israel from within. And in order to destabilize Israel from within, you have to use the resources that you already possess inside of the land of Israel. And these resources are the local Muslim Arabs. Let me emphasize Muslim Arabs, not Christian Arabs, who dwell there. These Arabs were then later known as the Palestinians. So the different Arab nations have come to support the formation of the Palestinian Liberation Organization, the PLO, Palestinian Liberation Organization, PLO, led by the now deceased Yasser Arafat. And that organization was intended to bring up and bring about the Palestinian national identity and to demand from the state of Israel a recognition of the Palestinian people and their right for sovereignty, and to allot them great masses of land in order that they could live in it. And now the political problem and historical problem that we have here is that prior to the 1967 war, the Six-Day War between Israel and the Arab armies, those Palestinians were not very keen on having any national aspirations. So you might wonder, what was then Gaza and what was then what's called the West Bank, actually Judea and Samaria? Well, these regions were controlled by Arab nations. The Gaza Strip was, for a very long time, for decades, controlled by Egypt, and then the area of Judea and Samaria, much of it, as well as Jerusalem, these areas were controlled by the country of Jordan. These are Sunni Muslim dominated nations. And when much of Judea and Samaria and Jerusalem was controlled by Jordan, with a lot of quote unquote Palestinians living there, and Gaza was controlled by Egypt, there was absolutely no call for the establishment of either a Palestinian identity or a Palestinian state. No, not at all. Because even if had anybody were in their right minds to think about something like this, the Egyptians or the Jordanians would have annihilated them instantly. They were not tolerant of such aspirations, but such aspirations were not expressed to begin with. They were only expressed after Israel had come to conquer the Gaza Strip and those parts of Judea and Samaria and Jerusalem which were dominated by Jordan before. That suddenly the Palestinians began to express their desire for national sovereignty. Now all of a sudden there are Palestinian people. They're no longer Egyptians or Jordanians. They were Palestinians. How interesting. And now you get to understand why in Gaza you have such a big group of people descending from the same tribe. El-Misri, the guy from Misr, from Egypt. Why do you think this is the case? It's the case because Egypt literally controlled that area. That many of them are Egyptians. As a matter of fact, the majority of them are probably Egyptians, the so-called Palestinians. And if you take a deep dive into their culture, then you see that it's hardly any different than the culture of other Sunni Arab Muslims from the region. They're very similar, depending on the tribe and the family and the group. They're very similar to either the Lebanese Sunni Muslims or the Syrian Sunni Muslims or the Jordanian Sunni Muslims or the Egyptian Sunni Muslims, because all of these are collectively Sunni Arabs from the areas surrounding the land of Israel, and they all share similar cultures with certain distinct differences. And all of these people came from those countries, nearly all of them. And even the ones who have been in the land of Israel for a very long time, for many generations, supposedly, have been there for a few thousand years less than the Jews, and that much is historical fact. And now we get to Hamas. So if we look at the history of the Hamas terrorist organization itself, it is actually an acronym. So Hamas is acronym for Haqqat al-Maqawma al-Islamiyya, Haqqat al-Maqawma al-Islamiyya, which is the Islamic Resistance Movement. Islamic Resistance Movement. All right. Lovely acronym, by the way, but they didn't choose it in random. Actually, the word Hamas is a word in the Arabic language, and it means enthusiasm, bravery, and religious fanaticism. Either one of the three. So enthusiasm, bravery, or religious fanaticism. But this is what the word Hamas means in Arabic. And you must remember that Arabic is a Semitic language, and Arabic has borrowed hundreds and potentially thousands of words from the Hebrew language. And did you know that the word Hamas was already extant in Hebrew all the way back in the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible? So let us examine what the word Hamas says in the Hebrew Bible. So the Hebrew definition for the word Hamas, a biblical word in Hebrew means violence, a wrong, unjust gain. Let me repeat that. In the Hebrew Bible, the word Hamas, which appears several times, means violence or a wrong, unjust gain. And it always appears in a bad connotation. Never does the word Hamas in Hebrew appear in the Hebrew Bible with a positive connotation. So let me give you some examples. The first example, I think, in the Hebrew Bible is the following verse. It's from the book of Genesis. I can't tell you exactly where in the book of Genesis, but you can find it yourselves. And it says, I'll read that in Hebrew and then I'll read you a translation by myself. ויאמר אלוהים לנוח, קץ כל בשר בא לפניי, כי מלאה הארץ חמס מפניהם, והנני משחיתם את הארץ. ויאמר אלוהים לנוח, קץ כל בשר בא לפניי, כי מלאה הארץ חמס מפניהם, והנני משחיתם את הארץ. So I read the verse twice, and the translation, again, by myself, but I gather I do a better job than the idiot King James, the idiot who did the King James version and also these other terrible versions in English. So the proper translation would be something like, and Elohim said to Noach, the Elohim is God, he says to Noah, it's Noach in Hebrew, folks. The end of all flesh shall come before me, because the land has been filled with Hamas from them, and I am to corrupt them from the land. So the translation that basically means God says to Noah that he sees or will see the end of all flesh, meaning the end of all humans that he does not like before him. Because why would he see their end? Because the land has been filled with Hamas from them or by them. And remember, he says that all flesh will end, the flesh of people will end, they'll be gone, because the land was filled with Hamas. They filled the land with violence, with wrongs, with unjust gain. That's what the word Hamas means. Okay? And I am to corrupt. That's another, when he says, hineni mashchitam, lehashchit, means to corrupt, but also to annihilate in biblical Hebrew. He's going to annihilate them from the land. Interesting. Okay, and then let's do just one additional verse here. This is from book of Ezekiel, chapter 7, verse 23. Ezekiel, chapter 7, verse 23. כי הארץ מלאה משפט דמים, והעיר מלאה חמאס. I'll read it again. כי הארץ מלאה משפט דמים, והעיר מלאה חמאס. So I'll do a free-form translation here, because the land was filled with the trials of blood, and the city was filled with Hamas. The traditional interpretation is the land was filled with the trials of blood, meaning there was murder, slaughter everywhere, and the city was filled with Hamas. So city was filled with what? What does Hamas mean? Again, I tell you, it means violence, wrong, and unjust gain. So, how curious that when those Palestinians form a national identity and then they create this terrorist organization Hamas, by the way, I didn't mention it, they created Hamas in 1987, okay? And then Hamas takes over the Gaza Strip. We'll get to that in a moment. Then Hamas chooses to name their organization after one of the worst, most negative words in the Hebrew Bible, which even means religious fanaticism in Arabic. Isn't that interesting? And how might I tell you something that would also carry some meaning later in this lecture? That Hamas has a constitution of sorts. They call it the Hamas Charter. I've read it, and you can look up the Hamas Charter online. I don't know how easy it is to find nowadays in English, but I've read it a number of times before. And the Hamas Charter, which is basically a document which states the religious and social goals of Hamas as an organization. By the way, it's a terrorist organization, but it also is a national political party. And as a political party, Hamas exists not only in the Gaza Strip, Hamas exists also in Judea and Samaria. So in the Hamas Charter, which is sort of like a constitutional document for this organization, it says, and this is a direct quote, "O Allah, O God, there will come a time when the Jews will run and they will hide behind the trees and the rocks, and the trees and the rocks will shout, 'Come here, there is a Jew behind me, come and kill him.'" There's several other references in the Hamas Charter to how all Jews should be killed. So we can already see, and that is no surprise, that Hamas is essentially carrying an ideology which is, I'd say, somewhat inspired by the Nazis, and is not very different. If you are calling upon the extermination of all Jewish people based on them being Jewish, how different can you be from the Nazis? If anything, at least the Nazis were in some aspects of their lives cultured and civilized Germans, which some people could argue whether it makes them better or worse. But Hamas are neither civilized nor cultured, and neither do they have German discipline. So that's what we get here in the Middle East, these kinds of animals. And anyway, we skip a little bit into the future. So Israel has been in control of the Gaza Strip since its conquest in 1967 in the Six-Day War. And then in 2007, Israel does something quite incredible. All of a sudden, the Israeli government, with support of the coalition parties and also some certain political parties which were outside the coalition, as well as massive support from the Israeli public, decides that we should actually pull our troops out of the Gaza Strip. And not only our troops. There are several 100,000 Jewish Israeli people living in the Gaza Strip, in the lovely, beautiful settlements. And the military, within the span, I think, of a week, got out of Gaza and took with it all of the Israeli Jews who lived there. Many of them opposed the plan, and they almost did not use any violence, of course, because they were evacuated by policemen and army officers and soldiers, most of whom were Jewish themselves. So we did not have a civil war over this, but we had very difficult feelings and emotions. We were uprooting these people from the Gaza Strip. They were living there. They had their lives there. They had, most of them were living in really nice villas. They had a good time. They established, a life, a career, a profession, everything. They were local Gazans, right? They're living in the Gaza Strip. And they were exiled from it by our own government because we wanted to allow the Palestinian people, so-called Palestinian people, to establish their own full sovereignty over the Gaza Strip. And we pulled out with both the military and the settlers. And what happened? Well, within a very short span of time, they had democratic elections for the first and only time. And much as has happened in Germany, if people know their history, Hitler got, I think, what was it, 30% of the votes in Germany. Supposedly, they must probably faked some of those votes as well. But once Hitler got 30% of the votes, and later the German parliament was burned, probably by the Nazis themselves, Hitler took over, and there were no more democratic elections until the end of the Second World War. This is the same deal with Hamas. They were democratically elected. I can't recall exactly, but I think the numbers were 60. They got 60% votes from the people of Gaza. And once they got in power, their first move was what? To basically kill off all resistance. So they killed every single member of the PLO, of the Palestinian Liberation Organization. And wait, you say, what, wasn't the PLO another terrorist group that supported Palestinian sovereignty and liberty and all that? Yes. Yes, they are. But you see, the PLO became the Palestinian Authority, and the PLO controlled the Palestinian territories in Judea and Samaria, whilst Hamas took over the Gaza Strip. The PLO, which became the Palestinian Authority, have somewhat of a secular vision for how they want to run things, whilst Hamas is not only a fanatical terrorist organization, far more radical than the PLO, but also they are religious zealots. So they don't want to do anything with that secular vision of how to run their bureaucracy. They enacted a radical Islamic state with Islamic religious law, Sharia law, in the Gaza Strip in 2007. And of course, the next people they killed were homosexuals, because the LGBT community is heavily persecuted and prosecuted in the Gaza Strip. If you are gay in Gaza and somebody finds out, they will hang you. And they will do to you exactly what they did to their political opponents. That is, after they hang you or kill you via less humane means, they will drag your dead body through the streets, tied to a motorcycle or a car or whatnot. And who knows what they even do with the bodies? I don't know. I've only seen the many videos and pictures of them dragging them through the streets. Do they, what, they feed? No, they wouldn't feed them to the pigs because they don't eat pigs. What they do with, did they burn them? I don't know what they did with all those bodies. Way too many bodies. But yeah, that's the situation. So basically, since 2007, we've all had this radical Islamic state in Gaza, which is essentially as bad as ISIS. Just as bad as ISIS in all respects. The women have no rights and they're all covered up from head to toe. Homosexuals are killed on the streets. Political opponents have all been killed or fled. And to top it all, they have this hobby. And the hobby is they shoot missiles at civilian populations in Israel. And since these are homemade missiles and are not very accurate, they just shoot them wherever. So these insane bastards just, roughly aim at this city or another and shoot a few hundred rockets, and whatever it hits, it hits. It might be a grandma or a cat or a hospital or a school. And trust me, they've hit all of them and more. They've hit just about anything. And most of the time they don't hit anything, but they don't care. And they kept shooting those rockets on an almost daily basis from Gaza since 2007. 2007. We are now in 2023. Folks, we're talking about 16 years of Israeli cities taking in rockets from Gaza. Now, I don't know about you, but I think any sane person would have stopped their neighbors from shooting rockets at them long before it was 16-year due. But I don't know, maybe you like rockets more than we do. And potentially there are more tolerant people out there in the world who'd taken rockets for, 30 or 40 or 100 years. But it seems like our tolerance has expired. And the Israeli tolerance has expired because Hamas has chosen to invade Israel. In a brilliant move on their part, they managed to completely surprise the Israeli Defense Forces. I won't get into the conspiracies and theories, and I know many of them, but right now I think very few people know what the truth is. I'll just say they did manage to breach with a force of what is estimated now to have been about 2,500 militants. Now, it's not just, you think, oh, 2,500 militants, that's not a lot. Well, try to think about 2,500 trained serial killers. Now, I would like to just describe to you as graphically and horribly as possible some of the things that those 2,500 serial killers have accomplished. So first of all, within the span of about 12 hours, they killed over 1,500 people and injured over 4,000 people. So they killed over 1,500 people and injured over 4,000. Now you might think, oh, 1,500 people, that's not a lot. Well, try to lose a relative to a terrorist, and that's one person. See how happy you are about that. It's just one person. Now, how about 1,500 and 4,000 wounded? And also take into account that Israel is a nation right now of roughly 10 million people. And if we were to compare this to 9/11, to the planes hitting the World Trade Center in the United States on the 11th of September of 2001, there were about 4,000 people killed, right? 4,000 people compared to 300 million, a population of 300 million. Compare that to 1,500 people with 4,000 injured compared to a population of 10 million. Actually, we had something in terms of just sheer numbers and statistics, relative to the size of our country and the size of our population. This was like 9/11 times 10. 9/11 times 10. Are you beginning to understand what happened here now? But it's much worse, because even if we were to assume that these were Muslim terrorists on those planes that rammed into towers, and not getting into that, they kidnapped one plane and they rammed two planes and rammed them into towers. Horrible. And a horrible, disgusting war crime, a crime against humanity. But now compare this with those 2,500 maniacs, those serial killers. Let me just describe to you what they did. So first of all, they go into these military outposts where they find many female soldiers. What they do, they rape them. They raped most of them. Some of them were killed before they could rape them alive, so they raped their corpses. On at least one occasion, they raped a soldier and then beheaded her, held the head up, cut off the genitals of a male soldier, and in front of his eyes, when he was still alive, took his cut off genitals and shoved them into the mouth of the severed head of the female soldier to perform mock oral sex while they laughed. By the way, how do we know about all of these things? Because those maniacs, they didn't just perform all of those horrible acts, they actually took care to film much of it on video, and uploaded it later, and much of it they even uploaded in real time to Arab social media. So we have the proof for everything. Now let me tell you a little bit about what else they did. So after they're done with the raping and the killing in the military bases, and they, by the way, they hijacked a lot of those soldiers and other female Israelis that they came upon later in the settlements surrounding Gaza, and they admitted under investigation in their videos now of some of them who were caught alive being interrogated, and they said that the orders were clear. They should be dirtied. And when they pushed them to say, what do you mean by dirtied? They explained, we were given orders to rape these women, either on the spot or once they get into Gaza, they would be raped. That was the purpose of taking them alive. Now, they start getting into settlements and they shoot just about anybody and everything they see. For example, they shot four elderly people in the head who were waiting at a bus stop. They got into people's houses and they shot their pets, dogs, cats, whatnot. They actually went so far as to visit the dairy farms in the settlements where they attacked and they would shoot all the cows in the head. In just one settlement, the dairy farm had 400 cows. All 400 cows were shot in the head. By the way, they weren't there to just kill the Jews. They were there to kill everything. This is why I say these are not these are not soldiers. These are serial killers. You see, they were there to kill everything that was alive and breathing. For example, amongst the many people they encountered were groups of dozens and dozens of foreign workers. Since we have a lot of people from China, Thailand, and Nepal working in the fields in southern Israel, because they make much more money working in Israel than they do in their countries of origin. And these people have great relations with Israelis. And these people, the Chinese, the people of Thailand, the Nepalese, they've never done anything to any Arab or Muslim person. They have no opinion about the local politics. They have no say about either Judaism or Islam or the Israel or the Palestinians. They don't care. They're totally neutral. But they killed them all nonetheless. They killed all those foreign workers and took a few dozen of them captives and haven't released them since. So I saw a video, for example. You see this poor foreign worker from Thailand. He's laying down on the floor, bleeding from his abdomen. Seems like a bullet wound. And and I saw this on video. And he is semi-conscious, I would say, barely trying to just hold himself and try to say something. Now the Arabs standing above him, who by the way took the video, the bastards from Hamas, from Gaza, they argue something that seems like whether he's Jewish or not. That he doesn't look Jewish. His skin is very dark. His skin is similar in tone to an African American, and he has very Asian-looking facial features. He looks like a person from Thailand. So one of them decides to kill him nonetheless, and the terrorist takes a shovel and tries to cut his head off with the shovel, just striking his neck again and again and again. But the shovel is not sharp, so he kills them with those blunt strikes with the shovel. I think he struck him 9 or 10 times until the guy wasn't moving anymore. Well, they kidnapped and killed Holocaust survivors. They killed children in front of their parents and parents in front of their children. There was one occasion, at least, when they tied up a woman with her body was found. She was tied up by the neck to a pole to watch her family being killed in front of her. There's so many things going on there. They kidnapped this 85-year-old grandma who looks rather senile, and in the garden of her own villa, a guy was standing next to her, and they took a video of this, and he made her do the V for victory sign with her fingers, supposedly in support of the Hamas effort. And of course, she's being coerced to do this. And then they put up another video when she's taken on an elderly people's cart into Gaza. It's probably her own cart that they stole. By the way, speaking of thievery and robbery, they encourage their friends, not people amongst those 2,500 serial killers, but people from the Gaza Strip. Once they started slaughtering all the settlers around Gaza, they invited their friends from Gaza to cross the border and pillage the homes of the recently murdered, which they did they by foot or on motorcycle or by car, even by donkey. They stole a whole lot of stuff from the houses of those poor victims. Now let's move on. What else did I not mention? It was found in just one settlement that they killed 40 babies, and then they piled them up and burned them, and they beheaded some of them. I'm not sure. So you already killed the baby. Why behead the baby? Well, because you're a fanatical Muslim insane terrorist. You're a serial killer. Okay, let me see. I have a list here. Let's see what else they did. Oh yes, what I did forget to mention is that a lot of their victims were burned alive. And there was at least one instance when they killed off a grandma who lived on her own, and then took her phone, and it's just difficult to say. They used her own Facebook account on her phone to upload a live stream video of her dead body to terrorize her family. Let me repeat that. They killed a grandmother, probably a Holocaust survivor, by the way, in her own home, and live streamed a video using her own Facebook account so her family would see her dead body and be terrorized. Have you ever heard in your entire life of something as vicious as this? I don't know. Very few things are as vicious. Now, by the way, they took roughly, estimates vary between 150 and 300 people that they took into Gaza, including foreign workers, as well as citizens of many different nations, including at least 11 Americans, several British people, French people, again, people from Thailand, from China, Nepal, and several other countries, Australia as well. But all of that sort of dwarfs, not in cruelty, but in terms of scale, relative to their biggest, largest act of mass murder that they enacted that day. Because they knew in advance that there was a big rave dancing party near the border of Gaza. It's just an open nature area that was fit for a lot of people to dance and have fun. And a lot of people came from all over the world, hence the circumstances under which people of different nationalities were taken. So this party called the Nova Party, an international party, had people dancing and celebrating for, I think, 2 days straight. And then in the early morning when the attack took place, there was first a barrage of missiles from Gaza, which stopped the party in its tracks, and people began evacuating. But exactly by that time, the terrorists were waiting for them outside, some say pretending to be police officers. They had their fake or stolen uniforms. And then they just started shooting everybody they saw. And they chased off those people from the large party, the Nova Party, who were running for their lives in open fields, gunning them down with AK-47s and shooting them down with RPG missiles. And both in the army outposts as well as with the Nova Party victims, a lot of people had gotten into shelters or hid behind objects. And you know what? Much like in the Hamas charter, where it says in the Hamas charter that the Jew will hide behind the rock and behind the tree, and the rock and the tree will say the Jew is here, come and kill him. Yeah, that's a prophecy come true, because, well, the rocks and the trees weren't talking, but certainly people were hiding behind the rocks and trees, and the vile terrorists came and they killed them point blank, and they made sure they were dead. They shot people not just with one bullet. At least, they're survivors from the Holocaust, often because the Nazis would just shoot one bullet and assume, maybe they live, maybe they don't. These people would shoot their victims with 5-10 bullets just to make sure they were dead. Who in their right minds, who goes into a nature party where people dance and have fun and starts shooting them with AK-47s and RPGs and chases them with vehicles and rapes the women that they find on the way in, and rapes their dead bodies and films it all and uploads it on live stream or uploads it later to social media? Who? There's only one type of group, not a single person, but a group. Only one type of group in the world that can enact things which are this vicious, and that is ISIS. And which brings us to the point that Hamas is ISIS. There's no difference. That this one's called ISIS and this one's called Hamas. You know, there are ISIS flags found in the bags, in the jeeps, the vehicles that were used by these terrorists. There's no difference between Hamas and ISIS. They have the exact same agenda, which is the utter and complete annihilation of every single Jewish person alive, which, if you remember, is the exact same agenda of the Nazis. Now, the Nazis had the Nazi ideology, and these guys are fundamentalist Muslims, but does it matter when the end result is the same? The end result is they just all want to exterminate every single Jewish person on the planet. And not by all means necessary, but by the most vicious means possible. Let me reiterate this. Not kill off all the Jews by all means necessary, but exterminate the Jews by the most vicious means imaginable and possible. Now, who is supporting this? How does Hamas get all their weapons? How do they get money? Those who support them are Iran. And that is an interesting partnership because Iran strives to be a regional, hegemonic superpower. The Iranian people see themselves as being affiliated and related to the ancient Persians. For some of them, that is true. Unlike the modern Egyptians, many of whom are not actually related to the ancient Egyptians, most of them are not, but with the Iranians, great numbers of them, a large percentage, are actually related to historical Persians and Babylonians. The people of Iran, my heart goes to you. I've never personally met a bad Iranian person in my life. I've always had a good time interacting with Iranian people. Iranians and Jews have very similar cultures, and we see eye to eye on many things. And unfortunately, Iran is held captive by this insane fundamentalist Islamic regime, which is very similar in ideology to Hamas. But even the fundamentalist, insane Islamic regime of Iran has never perpetrated things which are as barbaric as what Hamas had done recently to the settlers outside of the Gaza Strip. But this is an interesting partnership because the people of Gaza, including Hamas, are Sunni Muslims, and the Iranians are Shiite Muslims. And actually, they all share a religious war with one another. So they do believe that the Sunnis believe that the Shiites should be killed off, and the Shiites believe that the Sunnis should be killed off. But since Iran has a very strong incentive to get rid of Israel in the region, so it can be the local hegemonic superpower, then Iran is supportive of Hamas and has been since the founding of Hamas in 1987. Now, let me finish off by saying two things and also tying this back to biblical themes. First of all, I want you to consider, really, try to think deeply. What kind of a nation is capable of producing 2,500 serial killers all acting in unison? How many serial killers do you know? Did you know that currently in Israel, a nation of 10 million people, there isn't a single serial killer, active, criminally speaking, that I know of? And I was a police investigator and interrogator between the years 2006 and 2009. I've seen my fair share of crime. I worked with, rapists, extortionists, crime families, arsonists, you name it. Even back in the day, 2006, 2009, I don't remember a single serial killer in the state of Israel, and there hasn't been one probably in at least 20 years. So, suffice to say, we have crime. The crime rate in Israel is much lower than in the United States and Canada, in my opinion. But we do have crime, obviously. But Jews, on the whole, do not produce serial killers. Another casual example would be you would not be able to go back in history and find a Jew who suicide bombed anything. Seems like, as far as I can tell, 99.999% of people who ever suicide bombed in history were radical Muslims. Perhaps 100%. But I'm just, for the benefit of doubt, let's not assume it's 100%. Okay. So, how about this nation who can produce 2,500 serial killers all acting in unison? And it's just actually, it's not 2,500 serial killers. These are just the maniacs that got out the Gaza border this time around and killed all the settlers. By the way, also, there are many things that I didn't say. For example, they had this vile plan. They shot the houses, waited until people went into their safe rooms, and then set the houses on fire, burning them alive. And the way they set the houses on fire is they used the spare tires from people's cars and they rolled them into the house and set the tire on fire to set the house on fire. How diabolical is that? Anyway, Hamas is estimated to be 50,000 people in Gaza. So 50,000 Hamas fighters in Gaza out of a population of 2 million. You mean to tell me the population of 2 million people managed to produce 50,000 serial killers? Let's say it's not all 50,000 are serial killers. Okay, it's also not 2,500 because these are just the ones that cross the border. Let's just say maybe it's only 10,000 serial killers. What do you think? What should be done to a nation that can produce 10,000 serial killers? Do you think this is a reasonable nation? A viable culture? Something that the world ought to tolerate, to understand? I mean, what did the world do when the Nazis were active in trying to take over Europe and then the world? What did the Allies do? I'll leave it to you. I mean, go back to history books. What did the Allies do to the Nazis? Did we take pity on them? Did we take pity on the Nazi soldiers? On the members of the Hitler Youth? Oh, they were young. They're young, and so it was so easy to influence their fragile little Hitler Youth minds. Were we so tolerant back then? I don't think so. No, it doesn't seem to be the case. Now, to finish this off, let me tie this back to the biblical themes, and I'll let you be because this is a very long lecture. So in the Hebrew Bible, there are stories about this nation called Amalek. In English, they're called the Amalekites. And who are these Amalekites? There are nomad peoples that lived roughly in the area of the Dead Sea and the Sinai Desert, the Sinai Peninsula, and this region right about, potentially also in the area of the Gaza Strip, but I can't tell you exactly. And these peoples were notorious for their murderous and barbaric persecution of the Israelites, whom they went after following the Israelites' exodus from Egypt. The Amalekites would constantly slaughter people among them, pillage them, rape their people, etc. And thus there was what is said to have been a biblical commandment, a godly commandment in the Hebrew Bible to completely eradicate and exterminate the seed of the Amalekites, meaning that the Israelites were ordered by God in a way that was very extreme and unusual, I should say, relative to other peoples the Israelites have fought and that the Jews have fought over the years. They were ordered to kill them all. Men, women, children, the elderly, even the animals, to eradicate everything that had to do with the Amalekites. Why? Because the seed of the Amalekites was so vile, was so malicious, was so evil, that it could not be left alive. there could be no remnant to it. The Amalekites were the epitome of all that was bad about humanity, and so none of them could remain, and none did.